4.1 Ethical and Legal Issues and Implications in Sport and Exercise Science Research. Before we go into what the field of science is like today, in terms of what the legal and ethical issues are like, it will be useful to look to see what it was like in the past and how it is now to compare. Until as recently as 1947, there was no ethical and legal issues that scientists had to abide by when doing experiments. In the Second World War, the Nazis in Germany and in concentration camps across Europe were using POWs, prisoners of war, to conduct experiments. As you can imagine, there was no consent involved, and these test subjects were tested upon against their will. Some, if not most, of the experiments would have been grueling, and the test subjects must have been in unimaginable pain. Lots of these experiments carried out would result in test subjects dying. However, this was no problem because it wasn't German soldiers that were being experimented on. It was Jews and other types of prisoners of war who the Nazis thought were expendable. Unethical medical experimentation carried out by the Third Reich may be divided into three categories. The first category consists of experiments aimed at facilitating the survival of Axis military personnel to help German infantry defeat Allied armies. The second category of experimentation aimed at developing testing pharmaceuticals and treatment methods for injuries and illness which German military and occupation personnel encountered in the field. The third category of medical experimentation sought to advance the radical and ideological tenets of the Nazi worldview. The infamous were the experiments of Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz. Mengele conducted experiments on twins in particular. He also directed serological experiments on gypsies, as did Werner Fischer, to determine how different races withstood various contagious diseases. Other gruesome experiments meant to further Nazi racial goals were a series of sterilization experiments, undertaken primarily at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. These scientists tested many methods in their effort to develop an efficient and inexpensive procedure for the mass sterilization of Jews and disabled people and other groups the Nazi leaders considered to be racially or genetically undesirable. As said before, none of these test subjects would have done this out of their own will. They were forced to do so by the Nazi scientists. This type of thing would never be able to happen again in today's world of science, because there are laws and guidelines in place to make sure things like this never happen again. These guidelines that have been put in place states that consent must be given by test subjects, also that scientists must thoroughly explain exactly what the experiment is going to consist of. But between 1939 and 1945, this would not have been done by the scientists, and they would have proceeded doing the experiments on the test subjects with or without their consent. The Stanford Prison Experiment was a study of the psychological effects of becoming a prisoner or a prison guard. The experiment was conducted at the Stanford University on August 24 to 20th, 1971, by a team of researchers led by psychological professor Philip Zimbardo, using college students. It was funded by the U.S. Office of Naval Research in an investigation into the causes of difficulties between guards and prisoners in the U.S. States Navy and Marines. Some participants developed the role as guards and enforced authorization measures, and ultimately subjected some prisoners to psychological torture. Many of the prisoners passively accepted psychological torture and abuse by the guards' request. The guards also actively harassed other prisoners who tried to stop it. Zimbardo, as his role as superintendent, allowed this abuse to continue. 2 of the prisoners left mid-experiment, and the whole exercise was abandoned after 6 days. This experiment would not be able to be replicated in today's field of science. This is since psychological harm was done to those who were a part of the experiment. In today's scientific laws and guidelines, it states that no psychological or physiological harm can be done to any of the participants. Also, the fact that people who didn't wish to accept the psychological torture would have been harassed by those who took up the role as the guards. In today's field of science, if a participant wanted to walk away, no one could do anything unless they wanted to get into legal ramifications. The Milgram experiment on obedience to authority figures was a series of social psychology experiments conducted by Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram. They measured the willingness of studied participants, in particular men from a diverse range of occupations with varying levels of education, to obey the authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. The experiment found unexpectedly that a high-level proportion of people were prepared to obey a bleat unwilling, even if apparently causing serious injury and distress. The experiments began in July 1961, 3 months after the start of the trial of the German Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. Milgram devised his psychological study to answer the popular question at the time: could it be that Eichmann and his millions of accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we all call them accomplices? The experiments have been repeated many times in the following years with consistent results, with different societies, although not with the same percentages around the whole globe. The way in which Milgram carried out his experiment was by gathering volunteers that were recruited for a lab experiment. The participants were 40 males aged between 20 and 50, whose jobs ranged from unskilled to professional, from the New Haven area. They were paid just $4.50 for just turning up. They drew straws to determine their roles: learner or the teacher. Learner was strapped into a chair attached with electrodes. After he has learnt a list of words with pairs given to him, the teacher tests by naming the words and asking for the learner to recall its partner, or pair, from the list of 4 possible choices. The teacher is told to administer an electric shock every time the learner makes a mistake, increasing the level of the shock each time. There were 30 switches on the shock generator, marked from 50 volts, which is a slight shock, to 450 volts, which can be a dangerous and quite severe shock. The learner gave mainly wrong answers on purpose. For each of these, the teacher gave him an electric shock. When the teacher refused to administer a shock, the experimenter was given a series of orders and prods to ensure that the teacher continued to ask the questions. There were 4 prods, and if one was not obeyed, then the experimenter would read out the next prod, and so on. So the 4 prods: the first one was please continue, the second one was slightly more, the experiment requires you to continue, the third one, getting more intense, it's absolutely essential that you continue, and then the fourth one, you have no other choice but to continue. 65%, which is just over 2/3 of the participants, i.e. the teachers, continue to the highest level of 450 volts after being given the 4th order, but all participants continue to 300 volts anyway. If this experiment was carried out exactly how it was originally done by Milgram in today's field of science, there will be a lot of legal and ethical issues that would arise. One would be the shocks given to the participant learner. It stated that 450 volts were administered to the learner participant, which is a dangerously high level. Scientists are not allowed to inflict physical or mental harm on participants. So if this experiment was redone today, these shocks would be a huge problem. The second issue that stood out, because they have elements that conflict with today's legal and ethical barriers, were the orders that the experimenter gave to the teacher. The one in particular that stood out was the 4th one: you have no other choice but to continue. The reason why this stands out is because the teacher did not want to proceed with the experiment. However, the leading scientists would not let this happen until the experiment was completed. This is something that would not be acceptable within today's laws within the field of science. If a participant wishes to back out of an experiment, the leading scientist is by law not allowed to deny the participant's refusal to continue. BASES stands for the British Association of Sport and Exercise Science. BASES is the professional body for sport and exercise science in the UK. It is critical for a researcher for many reasons, such as providing a code of conduct that researchers must follow to study so that their studies are ethically and legally acceptable, and ultimately what they can and can't do. It is also a key organisation in sports science and allows researchers to be accredited if they feel the right needs, which includes things like the right level of experience, qualification and competence. If a researcher is BASES accredited, it looks very good for them on their own personal status, as it shows that they are a good scientist and a trustworthy researcher. There are many different issues that can be found in a researcher's study. There are 2 categories that issues can fall into. These categories are ethical issues and legal issues. According to the Oxford Dictionaries, ethicality or ethics can be defined as moral principles that govern a person's behaviour or conducting of an activity. So essentially, the rights and wrong in the conduction of research. Whereas legal issues is when you work within the boundaries of the law and requires decisions to be made by a court or judge. Therefore, legal issues must be working outside the boundaries of civil law. Now we're going to move on to some scenarios that I've made to look at what some of the ethical and legal issues could possibly be. So, at a young girls' gymnastics club, a group of scientists come to test out some new drugs that they have been working on to increase the gymnastics balance. A young girl is chosen from the group by both the head coach and scientist. However, this young girl does not wish to partake, and she is threatened to be kicked out of the gymnastics team by the coach if she does not go ahead with the experiments. Before the experiments were carried out, the scientists failed to complete a health screening questionnaire. This is vital because it would have informed them that their subject was heavily allergic to one of the key substances in their experimental drugs. After taking one of the drugs given to her by the scientists, the young gymnast asked to pull out from the experiment due to the allergic reaction she was experiencing. However, the head scientist denied her proposal to withdraw and told her she would continue until the experiment was complete. Once the experiment was over, the group of scientists published a scientific paper to show the world their findings. However, within this paper, they included information about the young girl, including her name, therefore breaching the data protection and confidentiality and anonymity laws within today's field of science. Now we're going to look at some consequences that these scientists may face if something like this did actually happen. So, the way in which this experiment was conducted could have caused the gymnast physical harm because of the drugs that she was taking. Also, the fact that her name was mentioned in the paper could have caused her to experience emotional harm as well. A possible consequence for the actual scientists is that they could be reprimanded or possibly suspended from future scientific practice. Now we're going to move on to my second scenario. So, a young gymnast under the age of 18 signs a form giving informed consent to partake in an experiment that the scientists said would determine if oxygen levels at higher altitudes could affect their performance. This is due to a future Olympic Games being held in countries which have high altitudes. The gymnast was told to enter a pressure chamber and carry out their normal mat routine as usual. She was told that the pressure would simulate oxygen levels at 5,000 feet. The actual experiment would be held at sea level. The gymnast entered the chamber with the air pressure being the same as it was outside, which was sea level. But once again, she was told to carry out her mat routine as usual. And the pressure was gradually decreased to reach a simulation of 5,000 feet, like the scientists had previously informed her. However, the scientists did not stop at this point, and told the gymnast to carry out her routine once again, even though it was already at 5,000 feet. She then began again, and the scientist decreased the pressure even more to reach a simulation of 8,000 feet. This is dangerously high, because going from low to high altitude quickly can cause symptoms such as severe headaches, loss of appetite, trouble sleeping. Once the routine was completed again, the gymnast left the chamber with a terrible headache, complaining that she felt nauseous. The scientists did not take into consideration the gymnast's health and safety, because in the worst case scenario, severe changes in air pressure can lead to what's known as pulmonary edema, or something as fatal as high altitude cerebral edema, where a person's brain swells with fluid, and the scientists did not take this in consideration when changing the air pressure within the chamber. Again, we're now going to look at the possible consequences for this scientist. There are lots of consequences that could be given to the scientist for conducting this experiment in such an unprofessional manner. The scientist could be heavily fined by the participant for compensation after being exposed to such low air pressure within the chamber. If the participant had experienced severity, and as previously discussed, then the scientist could be arrested and charged with unlawful conduct and even manslaughter. The scientist would most likely lose his accreditation due to the bad practices shown in the experiment.